The chandelier above me glittered like a constellation brought down to earth, casting shards of light across the ballroom of the Carter Foundation Gala. Crystal glasses clinked in a symphony of wealth, their sharp notes cutting through the hum of polite laughter and murmured deals. I stood near the edge of the polished marble floor, my fingers tracing the cool rim of my champagne flute, the bubbles rising like tiny prayers I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. The air smelled of money, old money, the kind that clung to silk dresses and tailored suits, the kind my family had bathed in for generations. It was suffocating, that scent, pressing down on me as I scanned the room, my pulse ticking a little faster than it should have. This wasn't just another night of smiling for the cameras or nodding at my father's donors. No, tonight was different. Tonight, I was about to set fire to the carefully constructed world I'd been born into. My left hand rested lightly on the arm of Jim Hawley, the man beside me whose presence was already drawing sidelong glances from the crowd. He wasn't one of us, not a Carter, not a name etched into the marble pillars of this city's elite. He was a public school teacher with a crooked smile and a stubborn streak I'd fallen for harder than I'd ever admit out loud. And on my ring finger, beneath the shimmer of the gala lights, sat the modest diamond he'd given me 3 nights ago, a promise that felt like defiance in a room like this. "Ready," Jim whispered, his voice low enough that it barely carried over the string quartet in the corner. His hand brushed mine, steady and warm, a tether to something real amid all this artifice. I nodded, though my stomach twisted with a mix of hope and dread. As I'll ever be. The gala was in full swing, 200 of Boston's finest swirling around us, their faces masks of practiced charm. My father, Edward Carter, held court near the bar, his broad shoulders squared beneath a tuxedo that cost more than most people's rent. He was laughing, that deep, commanding sound that made men lean in and women blush, but I knew the sharpness behind it. He'd built Carter Financial Holdings into an empire, and he wielded it like a scepter, expecting me, his only daughter, Allison Carter, to fall in line as the dutiful heir. My mother, Evelyn, floated nearby, her silver gown catching the light as she murmured to a senator's wife, her smile as brittle as the ice in her martini. They were a pair, my parents, a united front of ambition and control, and I'd spent 28 years learning how to navigate their expectations. But tonight, I wasn't their pawn. Not anymore. I took a deep breath, the air tasting faintly of perfume and cigar smoke, and stepped forward, pulling Jim with me. The crowd parted slightly, a ripple of curiosity following us as we moved toward the center of the room. My heels clicked against the marble, each step a drumbeat in my chest. I could feel eyes on me, some admiring the sleek lines of my black gown, others narrowing at the man on my arm. Whispers trailed us like shadows, and I caught fragments. "Who is he? Not one of the usual suspects. Ed won't like this. Let them talk." I'd give them something worth whispering about. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through the din as I raised my glass. The quartet faltered, then stopped, and the room turned toward me, a sea of expectant faces. My father's head snapped up, his gray eyes locking onto mine with a flicker of surprise. My mother's smile froze, her fingers tightening around her glass. I swallowed the knot in my throat and pressed on. "I'd like to make a toast." The silence was heavy, electric, every gaze pinning me in place. I could feel Jim beside me, solid and unyielding, and it gave me the courage to keep going. To the Carter Foundation, for another year of doing what we do best, building something bigger than ourselves. And to new beginnings. I lifted my left hand deliberately, letting the ring catch the light. A gasp rippled through the crowd, soft but sharp, like a blade sliding from its sheath. I'm thrilled to announce my engagement to Jim Hawley, a man who's shown me what it means to fight for something worth having. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then the applause started, tentative at first, then louder, though I could see the confusion in the faces of my father's cronies. Jim squeezed my hand, his pride radiating through the simple gesture, and I let myself smile, a real one, not the polished mask I'd worn for years. But beneath it, my heart hammered. I'd just thrown a match into a powder keg, and I knew it. My father didn't clap. He stood there, statue still, his jaw tight as granite. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting between me and Jim like she was calculating the damage. I'd defied them before, small rebellions like skipping law school for a business degree, but this was a declaration of war. Quite the statement, Allison. A voice drawled behind me. I turned to see Uncle Victor, my father's younger brother, swirling bourbon in his glass. His smirk was all teeth, the kind that promised trouble. Didn't know you had it in you. Guess I'm full of surprises. I shot back, keeping my tone light even as my nerves coiled tighter. Clearly. He tipped his glass toward Jim, then me, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place, amusement, maybe, or a warning. Victor was a wild card in the family, always hovering on the edges of power, never quite seizing it. I didn't trust him, but I didn't have time to decode him now. The crowd resumed its chatter, louder now, buzzing with the scandal I'd just handed them. I felt exposed, raw, like I'd peeled back my skin to show the world the mess underneath. But there was hope, too, a fragile thread weaving through the fear. I'd chosen Jim. I'd chosen me. And whatever came next, I'd face it head on. Al, Jim murmured, his breath warm against my ear. You okay? I nodded, though my hands trembled slightly as I set my glass on a passing tray.
Yeah.
Just waiting for the fallout. It didn't take long. My father's shadow loomed before I saw him, the weight of his presence pulling the air from the room. He didn't say a word at first, just stared at me, then at Jim, his gaze a cold blade slicing through the space between us. We need to talk, he said finally, his voice low and clipped, the kind of tone that brooked no argument.
Now.
I glanced at Jim, who gave me a small, steady nod. Then I followed my father toward the double doors leading to his private study, my pulse pounding in my ears. The gala's noise faded behind me, replaced by the echo of my own footsteps, and the sinking certainty that this was only the beginning. The double doors to my father's study swung shut behind us with a soft thud, sealing out the gala's distant hum and leaving only the oppressive silence of the room. The air here was different, thicker, cooler, tinged with the faint musk of leather and aged wood. I stood just inside the threshold, my heels sinking slightly into the burgundy rug, my eyes tracing the familiar lines of the space I'd once thought of as a sanctuary. Now it felt like a courtroom, and I was the one on trial. The study was a monument to Edward Carter's power. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, their shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes, law books, financial ledgers, biographies of men who'd shaped the world to their liking. A massive desk dominated the center, its surface polished to a mirror sheen, cluttered only with a crystal decanter of scotch and a single glass. Above the fireplace hung a row of portraits, stern-faced ancestors glaring down, their eyes accusing, as if they'd already judged me and found me wanting. The flickering flames below cast long shadows across their features, making them seem alive, watching. My father didn't sit. He stood behind the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette framed by the firelight. He was still in his tuxedo, the bow tie perfectly knotted, but there was a rigidity to him now, a coiled tension that made the room feel smaller. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, as I waited for him to speak. The weight of his silence pressed against my chest, heavier than the expectations he'd piled on me since I was old enough to understand the Carter name. You think this is a game, Allison? His voice finally broke the quiet, low and controlled, but laced with a fury I'd rarely heard directed at me. He turned then, his gray eyes boring into mine, sharp as steel. Parading that man out there like some kind of trophy, announcing an engagement without so much as a word to me or your mother? I swallowed, my throat dry despite the champagne still lingering on my tongue.
It's not a game, Dad.
It's my life. Jim's my choice. Your choice. He barked a laugh, short and bitter, and it stung more than I'd expected. You don't get to make choices like that without consequences.
Not in this family.
I took a step forward, my hands clenching at my sides. The portraits seemed to lean in, their painted gazes colder now. I'm not a child anymore. I don't need your permission to love someone.
Love.
He spat the word like it was poison, crossing the room in 2 strides to stand inches from me. Up close, I could see the lines etched deeper into his face, the strain behind his composure. This isn't about love, Allison. This is about duty. Legacy. You're the heir to Carter Financial Holdings, my life's work, and you're throwing it away on a schoolteacher who can't even afford the suit he's wearing tonight. His words hit like a slap, but I forced myself to hold his stare. Jim's worth more than your money. He's honest. He's real. Something this family's forgotten how to be. The air between us crackled, electric with years of unspoken tension. I'd always known he saw me as an extension of his empire, a piece to be maneuvered on his chessboard. But I'd never felt it this acutely, the suffocating weight of his ambition, the way it squeezed the air from my lungs. My defiance was a spark, and I could feel it catching, burning brighter even as fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. "You're naive," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me? Everything I've built is yours, provided you play by the rules. Marry someone who understands our world. Someone who can stand beside you in it, not drag you down." "I don't want your rules," I shot back, my voice trembling but firm. "I want a life that's mine. And if that means giving up the money, the name, all of it, then fine. I'll do it." He stared at me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, shock, maybe, or something closer to hurt. But it was gone as fast as it came, replaced by a hardness that chilled me to the bone. "You don't know what you're saying. You've never had to survive without this." He gestured vaguely at the room, the house, the life he'd given me. "You think you're strong enough to walk away? Prove it." The challenge hung there, heavy and sharp, daring me to call his bluff. My pulse pounded in my ears, a drumbeat of panic and determination. I'd come this far, stood up to him in front of everyone, claimed Jim as my own. There was no turning back now, not without losing myself completely. But the reality of it, the cost, loomed like a shadow I hadn't fully faced until this moment. "I will," I said, quieter now, but the words carried a weight I felt in my bones. "I don't need your empire to define me." He stepped back, his jaw tightening, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his armor, a fleeting uncertainty, like he hadn't expected me to push back this hard. "Then you're on your own," he said finally, his voice flat, final. "If you walk out that door with him, you're no longer a Carter. Not in my eyes." The room spun slightly, the portraits blurring at the edges of my vision. I wanted to scream, to cry, to claw at the injustice of it all, how he could reduce everything I was to a name I hadn't chosen. But I didn't. I straightened my spine, lifted my chin, and let the fire in me burn away the fear. "Goodbye, Dad," I said, turning toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but I didn't let it stop me. The wood was cool under my fingers, solid, a lifeline pulling me out of this suffocating space. "Allison." His voice stopped me, softer now, almost pleading. I paused, but didn't turn. "You're making a mistake. You'll see it soon enough." "Maybe," I said, my back still to him. "But it's mine to make." I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway, the gala's noise rushing back like a wave. My chest ached, a mix of grief and liberation tearing at me as I walked away from the study, from him, from the life I'd always known. Jim was waiting by the ballroom entrance, his face lighting up when he saw me, and that was enough to keep my legs moving, to keep the resolve from crumbling. But as I crossed the threshold, my father's words echoed in my skull, a warning I couldn't shake. I'd defied him, chosen love over legacy, and set something irrevocable in motion. The question wasn't whether there'd be a price, it was how high it would be. The ballroom stretched out before me like a gilded cage, its high ceilings and glittering chandeliers mocking the chaos churning in my chest. I could still feel the weight of my father's words pressing against my spine as I stepped back into the swirl of music and laughter, the gala carrying on as if nothing had shifted, like the ground hadn't just cracked open beneath me. My hands shook slightly, and I clasped them together, nails digging into my palms, trying to anchor myself. The air was thick with the scent of roses and bourbon, a cloying mix that made my head spin, but I kept my eyes on Jim, standing near the arched entrance to the terrace, his broad shoulders a beacon in the sea of tuxedos and gowns. He saw me coming, and his face softened, that quiet strength of his reaching out to steady me even from across the room. I moved toward him, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each step a deliberate choice to keep going, to not look back at the study door I'd just left behind. The whispers followed me, sharper now, a low hiss weaving through the crowd. She's leaving the family, engaged to him. Ed must be furious. They didn't even try to hide it, their voices curling around me like smoke, but I didn't care. Not anymore. Hey, Jim said when I reached him, his voice warm and low, cutting through the noise. He reached for my hand, his fingers rough but gentle as they closed over mine. You okay? I nodded, though it felt like a lie. I will be. My voice was steadier than I expected, but inside, I was a tangle of defiance and fear, hope and dread, all knotted together so tight I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He's done. With me. If I choose you. Jim's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. And what do you choose? You, I said without hesitation, the words spilling out like a vow. Always you. He pulled me closer, and before I could think, his lips were on mine. A kiss that was soft at first, then fierce, like he was claiming me right there in front of everyone. The room seemed to tilt, the murmurs swelling into a wave of shocked gasps and stifled laughter. I could feel the heat of 100 stares, the weight of their judgment, but Jim's hands on my waist grounded me, his breath against my mouth a lifeline. For a moment, it was just us, two people daring to carve out something real in a world built on deals and dynasties. When we pulled apart, the whispers had turned into a roar, a buzzing hive of speculation. I caught glimpses of faces, some amused, some appalled, all of them feeding off the drama I'd just handed them. My mother stood near the grand staircase, her silver gown shimmering as she stared at me, her expression unreadable but her posture rigid, like she was holding herself together with sheer will. Uncle Victor lingered by the bar, his bourbon glass raised in a mock toast, that sly grin of his promising chaos I didn't have the energy to unravel. We should go, I murmured to Jim, my voice barely audible over the din, before this gets worse. He nodded, his hand slipping to the small of my back as he guided me toward the terrace doors. The night air hit me like a slap as we stepped outside, crisp and cold, cutting through the haze of the ballroom. The city skyline glittered beyond the balustrade, a sprawl of lights that felt both distant and suffocating, a reminder of the empire I was walking away from. I leaned against the stone railing, my breath fogging in the February chill, and tried to steady the tremor in my chest. What happened in there? Jim asked, his voice gentle but firm, like he knew I needed to say it out loud to make it real. I stared at my hands, the modest diamond on my finger catching the faint glow of the terrace lanterns. He told me I'm no longer a Carter if I leave with you, that I'm throwing away everything he built. He thinks I'll regret it, that I'm too weak to survive without his money, his name. Jim stepped closer, his warmth pressing against the cold seeping into my skin. And what do you think? I think he's wrong, I said, my voice gaining strength as I met his gaze. But I'm scared he might be right. I've never had to do this alone. You're not alone, he said, his tone fierce, almost defiant. You've got me. We'll figure it out, together. His certainty was a lifeline, but it didn't erase the gnawing doubt clawing at me. I'd spent my life in boardrooms and ballrooms, surrounded by power I'd been groomed to inherit. Now, I was stepping into the unknown with nothing but a few $1,000s in a secret savings account and a man who loved me more than the legacy I was abandoning. It was exhilarating and terrifying, a tightrope walk over a chasm I couldn't see the bottom of. The terrace doors creaked open behind us, and I turned to see my father stepping out, his silhouette stark against the golden light spilling from inside. His face was a mask of control, but his eyes burned with something raw, anger, maybe, or desperation. Jim tensed beside me, his hand tightening on mine, but I didn't move. Not yet. Allison, my father said, his voice carrying that same clipped authority from the study, though softer now, like he was testing the waters. This doesn't have to be the end. Come back inside. We can talk this through, find a way to make it work. I stared at him, the man who'd shaped my world, who'd taught me strength even as he tried to cage it. The temptation was there, flickering at the edges of my resolve, to step back into the safety of a shadow, to smooth this over with words and compromises. But then I felt Jim's hand in mine, solid and unshakable, and I remembered why I'd walked out in the first place. There's nothing to talk about, I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my throat. You made your terms clear. So did I. His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. You're making a fool of yourself and me. Walking away won't prove anything except that you're too stubborn to see reason. Maybe, I said, echoing my earlier words to him, but it's my mistake to make. I turned away, pulling Jim with me toward the stone steps leading down to the gardens. My father's voice followed, sharp and final. You leave now, Allison, and you're done. No trust fund, no stake in the company, nothing. You'll get one night to clear out your things. That's it. The words landed like blows, each one heavier than the last, but I kept walking, my heels sinking into the gravel path. The gardens stretched out dark and silent, the roses stripped bare by winter, their thorns glinting in the moonlight. My chest tightened, a sob threatening to break free, but I swallowed it down. I wouldn't let him see me crack. Not now, not when I'd just burned every bridge behind me. Jim's arm slid around my shoulders, pulling me close as we reached the edge of the estate. We've got this, he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. One step at a time. I nodded, though my mind was racing. Where would we go? How would we live? The savings I'd stashed away wouldn't last forever, and Jim's salary wouldn't stretch far in a city like Boston. But beneath the panic, there was a spark, a stubborn flicker of hope I clung to like a lifeline. I defied my father, stood up to the weight of my name, and walked away with the man I loved. It was a start, a messy, uncertain one, but mine. The gravel crunched under our feet as we slipped through the wrought iron gate, leaving the gala's glow behind. The night swallowed us whole, and with it came the first real taste of freedom and the sinking fear of what it would cost. The gravel path gave way to asphalt as Jim and I crossed the estate's boundary, the wrought iron gate clanging shut behind us with a hollow finality that echoed in my chest. The night air bit at my bare arms, sharper now without the shelter of the mansion's walls, and I shivered, pulling my shawl tighter. Ahead, the driveway stretched long and dark, flanked by skeletal trees that clawed at the sky, their branches swaying faintly in the wind. The glow of the gala faded into a distant shimmer, its lights winking out one by one as we moved further from the only life I'd ever known. My breath fogged in front of me, quick and uneven, a mirror to the storm raging inside. Jim's hand stayed firm in mine, his step steady where mine faltered. I glanced at him, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, and felt a pang of gratitude so fierce it almost hurt. He didn't belong in that glittering cage any more than I did now, but here he was, walking into the abyss with me. The weight of my father's ultimatum hung over us like a guillotine, its blade glinting in the shadows. One night to pack, no trust fund, no safety net. Nothing but the clothes on my back and the man beside me. It was a choice I'd made, defending Jim, choosing love over inheritance, but the reality of it was sinking in, cold and relentless, and I couldn't shake the fear clawing at my throat. Where are we going? I asked, my voice small against the vastness of the night. The words trembled, betraying the bravado I'd clung to in the study. Jim stopped, turning to face me beneath the faint glow of a street lamp. His coat was wrinkled from the evening, his tie slightly askew, but his gaze was steady, anchoring. My place for now. It's not much, just a one-bedroom near Fenway, but it's ours tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. I nodded, swallowing hard. His apartment. I'd been there once. A cramped space with mismatched furniture and stacks of books spilling over every surface. It smelled of coffee and old paper, a far cry from the marble halls and rosewood polish of the Carter estate. The contrast hit me like a punch. My life, stripped down to a single room in a city that suddenly felt too big, too unforgiving. But Jim's hand squeezed mine, and I let that warmth pull me forward, one step at a time. The road curved toward the main gate, where Jim's beat-up Toyota waited, its faded blue paint chipped from years of Boston winters. He opened the passenger door for me, and I slid inside, the leather cold against my legs. The interior smelled faintly of gasoline and pine air freshener, a working man's scent that grounded me in a way the Gala's perfumed haze never could. Jim climbed in beside me, the engine sputtering to life with a reluctant groan, and we pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the mansion's silhouette shrank, its windows glowing like accusing eyes until they vanished behind a row of pines. I pressed my forehead against the window, the glass cool against my skin, and watched the world blur past. Streetlights flickering, brownstones looming, the Charles River glinting black and silent under the moon. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, a stranger I barely recognized. Who was I without the Carter name? Without the boardroom chairs and trust fund accounts? The question gnawed at me, sharp and insistent, but beneath it, something else stirred, a flicker of resolve, fragile but growing, like an ember refusing to die. He thinks I'll come crawling back, I said suddenly, my voice cutting through the hum of the engine. That I'll regret this by morning. Jim's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles whitening. Will you? I turned to him, the dashboard lights casting shadows across his face. No, I said, and the word felt like a promise to him, to myself. But it's not going to be easy. I've got maybe 10 grand in a savings account he doesn't know about. That's it. Everything else, my car, my apartment, it's all tied to him. 10 grand's a start, Jim said, his tone practical, unshaken. We've got my salary, too. It's not Carter money, but it's enough to keep us afloat while we figure things out. I laughed, a brittle sound that broke in the middle. Afloat. God, listen to us. 2 hours ago, I was toasting champagne in a ballroom, and now we're talking about scraping by like. I trailed off, the reality too raw to name. Like regular people? Jim finished, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Welcome to the club, Al. It's not so bad once you get used to it. I wanted to believe him, but the fear was still there, coiled tight in my chest. Regular people. I'd never been regular, never had to be. I'd grown up with private schools and summer homes, with a name that opened doors before I even knocked. Now those doors were slamming shut, and I was on the outside, staring at a life I hadn't prepared for. But Jim's calm, his quiet certainty, was a lifeline I clung to, even as doubt whispered in the back of my mind. The car slowed as we turned onto a narrow street, the sodium glow of street lamps pooling on the cracked pavement. Jim's building came into view, a squat, red brick walk-up with chipped paint and a flickering neon sign for a deli downstairs. He parked along the curb, the engine ticking as it cooled, and for a moment, we just sat there, the silence heavy between us. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in, the confrontation, the walk away, the irreversible line I'd crossed. My father's voice echoed again. You're done. And yet, here I was, still breathing, still choosing. Come on, Jim said, opening his door. Let's get inside. You need sleep. I followed him up the creaking stairs, the hallway dim and smelling faintly of mildew. His apartment was on the 3rd floor, a single bulb buzzing overhead as he fumbled with the key. The door swung open to reveal a small, cluttered space, bookshelves sagging against one wall, a couch with a threadbare blanket tossed over it, a kitchenette barely big enough for a stove. It was messy, lived in, nothing like the sterile perfection of my old life. And yet, as I stepped inside, something in me unclenched, just a little. Jim kicked off his shoes and turned to me, his expression softening. You're shaking, he said, stepping closer. His hands found my arms, rubbing warmth into them through the thin fabric of my shawl. I didn't notice, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But now that he'd said it, I felt it, the tremor running through me, the adrenaline crashing hard. Jim, what if I can't do this? What if he's right? He pulled me into his chest, his arms solid around me, and I let myself sink into him, the steady beat of his heart grounding me. You can, he said, his voice low and fierce. You already are. You stood up to him, walked away from everything he threw at you. That's not weakness, Al. That's strength I've never seen in anyone else. I closed my eyes, breathing him in, the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth of his skin. He was right. I'd made my stand, defended him, chosen us. But the cost was sinking in, and with it came a new determination, sharp-edged and raw. I wasn't just walking away from my father. I was walking toward something I'd built myself, brick by stubborn brick. The fear was still there, a shadow I couldn't outrun, but it wasn't alone anymore. There was resolve, too, and a pride I hadn't known I could feel. We'll need a plan, I said, pulling back to look at him. Tomorrow I'll go back for my things. Then we start over. Really start over. Jim nodded, his eyes gleaming with something like admiration. Whatever it takes. You and me. I managed a small smile, the first real one since the gala. The apartment felt less like a cage now, more like a beginning, humble, uncertain, but ours. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent to the war I'd just waged, but in here, with Jim's hand in mine, I felt the first stirrings of something powerful, a determination to prove my father wrong, not out of spite, but for myself. The lights of the mansion were long gone in the rear view, but the road ahead stretched wide and uncharted. I'd chosen love over inheritance, and now the fight was on, not just to survive, but to build something better. Something mine. The clock on Jim's kitchenette wall ticked past midnight, its hands slicing through the quiet like a blade. I sat on the edge of his sagging couch, my bare feet curling into the worn rug, the gala gown swapped for one of his old t-shirts that hung loose over my shoulders. The apartment was a cocoon of dim light and shadow, the single bulb overhead buzzing faintly, casting a yellow glow across the peeling paint and stacks of grading papers scattered on the coffee table. Outside, the city growled, a distant siren, the rumble of a late-night bus, but in here, it was just us, the air thick with the scent of instant coffee and the weight of what I'd done. My handbag sat open beside me, its contents spilled out like a confession. My phone, a tube of lipstick, and the slim envelope holding the key to my secret savings, $10,000, stashed over years of quiet rebellion. It wasn't much, not compared to the Carter fortune, but it was mine, a lifeline I'd clung to without knowing why until tonight. My fingers brushed the envelope, the paper cool and crisp, and I felt a jolt of something fierce, pride, maybe, or the first flicker of a plan taking shape. Jim leaned against the kitchen counter, his sleeves rolled up, watching me with that steady gaze that always saw too much. "You're thinking hard over there," he said, his voice soft but edged with curiosity. "What's going on in that head of yours?" I looked up, meeting his eyes, and let the words spill out before I could second-guess them. "I'm not going back. Not to beg. Not to grovel. He thinks I'll break, Jim. He thinks I'll come running when the money runs out. But I won't." My voice trembled, but it hardened as I spoke, resolve coiling tight in my chest. "I'm going to build something. Something he can't touch." He raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Build what?" "Al, we've got 10 grand and a couch that's seen better days. What's the play?" I stood, pacing the tiny space, my bare feet scuffing against the rug. The walls seemed to close in, but I pushed past the claustrophobia, my mind racing. "Phoenix Capital," I said, the name hitting the air like a spark. A financial firm, small, scrappy, focused on people he'd never looked twice at. Small businesses, startups, regular people trying to make it. I've watched him run Carter Financial my whole life. I know the game. I can play it better. Jim's lips twitched, not quite a smile but close. "Phoenix, huh? Rising from the ashes? Exactly. I stopped pacing, turning to face him. The apartment felt less like a prison now, more like a war room. He cut me off, gave me until morning to clear out.
Fine.
I'll take what's mine, my clothes, my laptop, a few things he won't miss, and I'll start over. But I'm not just surviving, Jim. I'm fighting. He stepped closer, his hands finding my shoulders, grounding me. You sure about this? It's not just him you're up against. It's the whole damn system he built. Money, connections, power. You're starting from scratch. I know, I said, my voice steady now, though my heart pounded. And I'm terrified. But I've been a shadow too long, following orders, playing the part. This is my shot to be something else. Something real. I swallowed, the fear still there, clawing at me, but it was matched by a fire I hadn't felt before, a hunger to prove myself, not to him, but to me. The room shrank around us, the peeling paint and sagging shelves fading into the background as I pictured it. A tiny office somewhere, a desk piled with papers, clients who'd never set foot in my father's marble halls. I could see the late nights, the cheap coffee, the slow climb, and I wanted it more than I'd ever wanted the trust fund or the corner office at Carter Financial. It was a vision born of defiance, yes, but also of a pride I hadn't known I could claim. What about tomorrow? Jim asked, his voice pulling me back. He said morning means we've got, what, 6 hours to get your stuff? I nodded, glancing at the clock.
We'll go at dawn.
My apartment's in Back Bay. Everything's on his dime. But I've got some files, contacts I've built on my own. Enough to start. My mind spun, plotting the moves. A quick in and out, dodging the doorman's questions, grabbing what mattered before my father's deadline hit. Then we come back here. I'll work from this couch if I have to. Jim grinned, a real one this time, his eyes glinting with something like awe. You're crazy, you know that? But I'm in. All the way. I laughed, a shaky sound that broke the tension, and sank back onto the couch. He sat beside me, his arms sliding around my shoulders, and for a moment, I let myself breathe. The fear was still there, a cold thread weaving through my resolve, but it wasn't alone anymore. There was determination, too sharp and unyielding, and a pride that felt like armor. My father thought he'd broken me, cast me out to watch me fail. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The clock ticked on, each second a step closer to morning, to the fight I'd chosen. Phoenix Capital was just a name now, a flicker in the dark, but it was mine. And as the city hummed beyond the thin walls, I felt the first stirrings of something unstoppable, a resolve to rise, not just from his ashes, but from my own. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, relentless hum that drilled into my skull as I sat at the battered desk in Phoenix Capital's so-called office. The room was a shoebox, wedged between a dry cleaner and a pawn shop in a part of Boston my father wouldn't have deigned to drive through, let alone step foot in. The walls were a dull beige, stained with years of neglect, and the single window offered a view of a dumpster and a brick wall tagged with faded graffiti. My laptop glowed in front of me, its screen casting a harsh blue light across the piles of papers, loan applications, client emails, a scribbled budget that mocked me with its red ink. The air smelled of stale coffee and desperation, a bitter tang that clung to my throat as I rubbed my temples, trying to ward off the headache that had settled in hours ago. It had been 3 years since I'd walked away from the Carter estate, 3 years since I'd sat on Jim's couch and named this dream Phoenix Capital. We'd clawed our way here, me and Jim, starting with that 10 grand and a stubborn refusal to let my father's prophecy come true. The first year had been a blur of sleepless nights, cold calls, and ramen dinners, but slowly, it took shape. A client here, a loan there, small businesses we'd helped keep afloat when the banks wouldn't touch them. Now, Phoenix was a fledgling firm, teetering on the edge of something real, with a handful of employees and a reputation that was starting to whisper through the city's underbelly. I'd built it from nothing, brick by defiant brick, and every time I walked through that creaking door, I felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost drowned out the fear. Almost. The clock on my desk read 2:17 a.m., its red digits glaring at me like an accusation. Jim was asleep on the cot in the corner, his breathing steady beneath the threadbare blanket I dragged from his apartment. He'd been with me every step, grading papers by day and crunching numbers for Phoenix by night, his faith in me a rock I leaned on too hard sometimes. I glanced at him, his face soft in the dim light, and felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. He deserved better than this, better than a cot in a crumbling office, better than the strain I saw creeping into his eyes lately. But we were in too deep now, and the pressure was mounting, a vice tightening around us both. The email on my screen was the latest blow, its subject line stark and unforgiving. Carter Financial Holdings requests emergency meeting. I'd read it a dozen times already, each word sinking deeper into the pit of my stomach. My father's empire, his life's work, the legacy he'd tried to chain me to, was faltering. The news had been trickling in for months. Bad investments, a scandal involving a board member, whispers of insolvency. But this was a scream, a desperate plea disguised as a demand. They wanted to meet tomorrow. Today, technically, in their sleek downtown tower, the kind of place where the air smelled of leather and power, not mildew and defeat. And they wanted me there. I leaned back in the chair, its springs groaning under my weight, and stared at the ceiling. A water stain spread across it like a bruise, dark and jagged, mirroring the chaos in my head. My fingers curled into fists, nails biting into my palms as I fought the tide of emotions crashing through me, anger, dread, a twisted flicker of satisfaction I didn't want to name. He'd cut me off, cast me out, bet on my failure. And now here I was, 3 years later, with a company of my own, while his was cracking at the seams. Part of me wanted to laugh, to savor the irony of it, but the rest of me was drowning in the weight of what it meant. He needed something from me, the daughter he disowned, and that knowledge was a blade, sharp and double-edged. The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in, the hum of the lights louder, more insistent. I stood, pacing the narrow strip of carpet between the desk and the filing cabinet, my bare feet silent against the worn fibers. My reflection flickered in the window, pale, hollow-eyed, the lines of strain etched deeper than they'd been at 28. I'd poured everything into Phoenix. Every ounce of grit, every shred of pride, every dollar we could scrape together. It was my defiance made flesh, my proof that I didn't need his name or his money. But it was fragile, too, a house of cards trembling in the wind. One wrong move, one bad month, and it could all collapse. And now, with this meeting looming, the stakes were higher than ever. Al? Jim's voice, rough with sleep, cut through the silence. I turned to see him sitting up, rubbing his eyes, the blanket pooling around his waist. "What time is it?" "Late," I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Go back to sleep." He didn't. He swung his legs off the cot and crossed the room, his presence warm and steady despite the shadows under his eyes. "You're wound tight as a spring. What's going on?" I hesitated, then nodded at the laptop. Carter Financial's circling the drain. "They want me downtown tomorrow." "An emergency meeting." His brows shot up, surprise flickering across his face before it hardened into something else. Resolve, maybe, or anger on my behalf. "Your father?" "Probably." The word tasted bitter, like bile rising in my throat. "Or one of his lackeys. Doesn't matter who's holding the leash, they're desperate. I can smell it through the screen." Jim studied me, his gaze piercing in that quiet way of his, like he could see the storm behind my calm. "What do they want from you?" I laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed off the walls. "Money, maybe. A bailout. Or they've heard about Phoenix, how we're picking up the scraps they've left behind. Could be they want a piece of it, or to crush it before it gets any bigger." I ran a hand through my hair, tugging at the roots. "I don't know, Jim. But whatever it is, it's a trap. I can feel it." He stepped closer, his hands settling on my arms, grounding me like he always did. "Then why go?" "Because I have to," I said, my voice cracking under the strain. "If I don't, they'll think I'm scared." That I'm still the girl who walked away with her tail between her legs. I've built too much to let them see me flinch now. His grip tightened, not painful but firm, a silent promise. You're not that girl anymore. You're stronger than he ever gave you credit for. But you don't have to face this alone. I'm coming with you. I shook my head, pulling back slightly.
No.
This is my fight. I need you here, keeping Phoenix running. If I'm walking into a snake pit, I can't risk us both getting bitten. His jaw clenched, frustration flashing in his eyes. But he didn't argue. He knew me too well, knew the stubborn streak that had carried me this far wouldn't bend now. Fine, he said finally, his voice low. But you call me the second it's over. Promise me. I will, I said, and the words felt like a lifeline, tethering me to something solid as the ground shifted beneath me. I sank back into the chair, my legs trembling beneath the desk, and Jim sat on the edge of it, close enough that I could feel his warmth. The email glared at me, a summons I couldn't ignore, and with it came a flood of memories. My father's cold dismissal, the gala's glittering cage, the night I'd chosen Jim over everything else. I'd thought that was the hardest stand I'd ever take, but this was different. This was Phoenix on the line, the life I'd built, the proof that I could survive without him. And now he was back, or his shadow was, reaching out from that marble tower to test me again. The anger came first, hot and jagged, surging through me like a current. He'd bet against me, called me weak, and now he wanted to drag me back into his orbit? I wanted to storm into that meeting and throw his failure in his face, watch him squirm as I stood tall over the ashes of his empire. But then the fear crept in, cold and insidious, whispering doubts I couldn't silence. What if Phoenix wasn't enough? What if I'd gambled everything, Jim, our future, my pride, and lost? The room spun slightly, the walls tilting, and I gripped the desk, my knuckles whitening. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. He's got all the power still, money, lawyers, the name. I've got this. I gestured vaguely at the office, the flickering light, the stack of bills we couldn't quite pay. Jim slid off the desk and knelt in front of me, his hands cupping my face, forcing me to meet his gaze. You've got more than this, Al. You've got guts. You've got a mind sharper than anyone in that tower. And you've got me. He doesn't know what he's up against, not really. His words sank in, steadying me, and I felt the fire flare again, pushing back the fear. He was right. I wasn't the same Allison who'd walked away trembling. I'd built Phoenix from nothing, fought for every inch, and I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers. But the pressure was crushing, a weight I could feel in my bones, and I knew this meeting wasn't just a challenge. It was the crucible that would either forge me or break me. The clock ticked on, 2:23 now, each second a heartbeat counting down to dawn. I leaned into Jim's touch, drawing strength from him, and made a choice, not out of desperation, but out of a resolve that felt like steel hardening in my chest. I'll go, I said, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. And whatever they throw at me, I'll face it. Phoenix isn't just a company, it's me. And I'm not letting him take it. Jim nodded, his eyes fierce with pride, and stood, pulling me up with him. Then we've got work to do. Coffee's on me. I managed a small, shaky laugh as he moved to the ancient percolator in the corner, the familiar ritual grounding me. The office was still a wreck, the email still a threat, but as the scent of coffee filled the air, I felt the shift inside me. Fear giving way to determination, anger sharpening into purpose. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that tower, not as Edward Carter's daughter, but as Allison Hawley, the woman who'd risen from his ashes. And whatever came next, I'd fight for it with everything I had. The elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss, spilling me into the 47th floor of Carter Financial Holdings' downtown tower. The air hit me first, cool, sterile, laced with a faint tang of leather and citrus polish, a scent that dragged me back to a life I'd spent 3 years escaping. My heels sank into the plush gray carpet as I stepped out, the sound muffled, like the world was holding its breath. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched along the corridor, framing a view of Boston's skyline that glittered under the morning sun, all sharp angles and glass spires piercing the sky. It was breathtaking, commanding, a throne room for the empire my father had built, and now, apparently, was losing. I adjusted the lapels of my blazer, a navy number I'd picked up secondhand, but tailored to fit like armor. My reflection flickered in the glass as I passed, sharp cheekbones, eyes shadowed from a sleepless night, a woman who'd clawed her way up from nothing. The email had kept me awake, its words looping through my skull like a taunt. Asterisk emergency meeting.
Today.
9 a.m. Asterisk no details, just a summons, and the weight of it had settled into my bones. Phoenix Capital was my shield, my sword, but this place, this tower, was a battlefield I hadn't walked in years, and every step echoed with the ghosts of who I'd been. The receptionist barely glanced up from her sleek desk, her manicured fingers tapping at a keyboard. "Miss Holly," she said, her voice clipped, professional, tinged with a curiosity she didn't bother to hide. "They're waiting in the boardroom. End of the hall on your right." I nodded, my throat tight, and started down the corridor. Mahogany panels lined the walls, punctuated by gilt-framed photos of my father shaking hands with senators, CEOs, men who'd shaped this city in their image. His image. My pulse thudded in my ears, a drumbeat of dread and defiance, as I passed a portrait of him. Younger, sharper, his gray eyes staring out with that unrelenting certainty I'd once mistaken for strength. Now it just looked like arrogance, brittle and cracking. The boardroom doors loomed ahead, double slabs of dark wood polished to a mirror sheen. I paused, my hand hovering over the handle, and felt the air shift, thicker now, charged with the weight of what lay beyond. My chest tightened, a vice of anger and fear squeezing my ribs, but beneath it burned something hotter, something I'd nursed for 3 years. Pride. Phoenix Capital wasn't just a company. It was my defiance, my proof, a middle finger to every doubt he'd ever thrown at me. Whatever he wanted, whatever trap this was, I'd face it standing tall. I pushed the doors open. The room stretched out before me like a cathedral of power, all glass and steel and money. A massive oak table dominated the center, its surface gleaming under recessed lights, surrounded by a dozen leather chairs, most of them occupied. Men in tailored suits, women with diamond studs glinting at their ears, all turning to stare as I stepped inside. Their faces were a gallery of surprise, suspicion, and something darker, desperation, maybe, or the faint whiff of defeat. The windows behind them framed the city like a trophy, but the air was stale, heavy with tension that pressed against my skin. And there, at the head of the table, was my father. Edward Carter stood with his back to me, hands clasped behind him, staring out at the skyline like a king surveying a kingdom he still believed was his. His suit was immaculate, charcoal gray, but his shoulders carried a slump I'd never seen before, a weariness that made him smaller, somehow, than the giant I'd built him up to be. He didn't turn immediately, and that silence, that deliberate pause, was a weapon I knew too well. It was meant to unnerve me, to shrink me back into the girl who'd trembled under his gaze. But I wasn't that girl anymore. "Glad you could make it, Allison," he said finally, his voice smooth, edged with a control that didn't quite hide the strain. He turned then, and our eyes met, his gray and piercing, mine steady despite the storm raging inside. The lines on his face were deeper now, carved by time and pressure, and there was a flicker in his expression, brief but real. Recognition. Not just of me, but of something in me he hadn't expected. "I wasn't given much choice," I said, keeping my tone even as I crossed the room. I didn't sit, not yet. I stood at the opposite end of the table, my hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, claiming my space. "Your email was light on details. What's this about?" A murmur rippled through the board, glances darting between us like sparks. My father's lips twitched, not quite a smile, and he gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. We've got a lot to cover." I hesitated, every instinct screaming that sitting was surrender, but I couldn't afford to look rattled. Not here, not now. I pulled the chair out, the leather creaking under my weight as I settled in, my spine straight, my hands folded on the table. The room watched, a jury of vultures waiting for blood, and I felt the weight of it. The power they still held, the empire I'd walked away from, now teetering on the edge. "Carter Financial's in trouble," he said, cutting straight to it, his voice flat but laced with a bitterness that surprised me. "Bad investments, a few key clients jumping ship, legal fees piling up from that mess with Grayson last year. We're bleeding cash, and the banks are circling." I leaned back slightly, my fingers tightening around each other. "I've heard the rumors. Didn't realize it was this bad." "It's worse." A voice piped up to my left. Uncle Victor, slouched in his chair, a tumbler of bourbon in hand despite the hour. His smirk was sharper now, less playful, like a blade honed by resentment. "We're staring at bankruptcy, unless we pull a rabbit out of the hat. Fast." My father shot him a look, sharp enough to cut glass, but didn't contradict him. Instead, he slid a folder across the table toward me, its edges crisp against the polished wood. "Open it." I reached for it, my movements deliberate, refusing to let them see the tremor in my hands. The folder was thin, but heavy with implication. Inside were financials, Carter Financials, specifically pages of red ink, declining assets, a balance sheet that screamed collapse. And then, tucked at the back, a proposal, strategic partnership with Phoenix Capital. My breath caught, a sharp hitch I couldn't hide. I looked up, meeting my father's gaze, and saw the trap snap shut around me. "You want my company," I said, the words slow, deliberate, tasting of bile as they left my mouth. "Not want," he corrected, leaning forward, his hands braced on the table.
Need.
"Phoenix has traction, small, yes, but growing. You've tapped a market we ignored, built something lean where we got fat. A partnership could stabilize us, buy us time to restructure." I laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that startled even me. "Stabilize you? You mean bail you out? After you cut me off, told me I'd fail without your name? And now you come crawling to me, because I didn't." His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin, but he didn't flinch. "This isn't about pride, Allison. It's about survival. For both of us. Both of us." I shoved the folder back across the table, the papers scattering slightly. "Phoenix is mine. I built it without you, without your money, your connections, your rules. You don't get to claim it now because you're drowning." The room went still, the air so thick I could barely breathe it. The board members shifted, uncomfortable, their eyes darting between us like spectators at a duel. Victor took a slow sip of his bourbon, his grin widening, feeding off the chaos. But my father, he didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with a mix of fury and something deeper, something I hadn't seen in him before. Respect, maybe, or regret. It twisted the knife in my gut because I didn't want it, not now, not like this. "You've done well," he said, quieter now, the words measured but heavy. "Better than I thought you could. Phoenix is proof of that. But you're still small, still vulnerable. If we go down, the fallout will hit you too, clients, suppliers, the whole ecosystem. You think you're untouchable, but you're not." I stood, the chair scraping against the carpet, my hands trembling with the force of holding myself together. "Don't lecture me about vulnerability. I've lived it, slept on a cot, ate cold takeout, fought for every dime while you sat up here counting your losses. Phoenix isn't your lifeline. It's mine." He rose too, matching me, the table a battlefield between us. "And what happens when we collapse? When the banks freeze you out because of the mess we leave behind? You're in this game now, Allison, whether you like it or not. You can't just walk away again." The words landed like blows, each one sharper than the last, because he wasn't wrong. Not entirely. Phoenix was strong, but fragile, a fledgling bird in a storm I hadn't seen coming. The anger in me roared, a wildfire fed by years of his dismissal, his ultimatums, his certainty that I'd fail. But beneath it, fear gnawed, a cold, creeping doubt that maybe I'd built too much to lose, that maybe he still held the power to pull me under. I'm not walking away, I said, my voice low, cutting through the silence like a blade. I'm standing here, telling you no. You don't get to take what I've built. You don't get to win this time. His eyes narrowed, but there was that flicker again, recognition, a mirror of the fire he'd once had, now burning in me. You're stubborn, he said, almost to himself. Like me. Better than you. I shot back, and the room held its breath. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a stare that felt like the sum of everything. Every fight, every choice, every night I'd spent proving him wrong. The boardroom faded, the suits and the skyline blurring into nothing, until it was just us, a father who'd lost his grip and a daughter who'd found hers. My chest ached, a tangle of triumph and grief, because this was the climax I'd never wanted, a victory that tasted like ash. Then save yourself, he said finally, his voice rough, breaking the spell. But don't say I didn't warn you. I turned, my legs steady despite the quake inside, and walked toward the doors. The boardroom watched, silent, as I pushed them open and stepped back into the corridor, the cool air hitting me like a slap. My father's words echoed in my skull. Asterisk, save yourself, asterisk, but they didn't shake me like they once would have. I'd built Phoenix from nothing, turned defiance into power, and I wasn't about to let him drag it down now. The elevator doors closed behind me, and as the numbers ticked down, I felt the shift, anger hardening into resolve, fear burning away under the weight of what I'd done. This wasn't reconciliation, not yet, maybe not ever. But it was a reckoning, a line drawn in the sand, and I'd crossed it with my head high. Phoenix was mine, and whatever came next, collapse or conquest, I'd fight for it with everything I had. The streetlights outside my office window flickered like dying stars, casting a faint, uneven glow across the chipped paint and cracked pavement below. It was late, past midnight, though the clock on my desk had stopped ticking hours ago, its hands frozen at 7:42 as if time itself had given up on keeping pace with me. Phoenix Capital's headquarters wasn't much to look at, a narrow, second-floor walk-up above a bodega, its neon sign buzzing faintly through the thin walls. The room smelled of burnt coffee and ink, the air thick with the residue of a day that had stretched too long. Papers littered my desk, contracts, projections, a scribbled list of terms I'd been mulling over since I'd walked out of Carter Financial's tower that morning. The city hummed beyond the glass, a restless beast that never slept, its lights smearing into a kaleidoscope of gold and shadow as I stared out, my reflection a ghost in the pane. I leaned back in my chair, the springs creaking under me, and rubbed my eyes with the heels of my hands. The meeting replayed in my skull like a film reel stuck on loop. My father's strained voice, the boardroom's suffocating silence, the folder sliding across the table with its desperate plea disguised as a partnership. I'd walked away, head high, voice steady, but the victory felt hollow, a brittle shell around the ache in my chest. 3 years of fighting, scraping, building Phoenix from nothing, and now here it was, the moment I dreamed of, dreaded, and never quite believed would come. Carter Financial was crumbling, and they'd turned to me, not to crush me, but to save them. The irony was sharp enough to cut, but it didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like ash, like something ending I hadn't fully grieved. A knock at the door jolted me upright, my pulse spiking as I glanced at the shadowed glass panel. No one came here this late. Not Jim, who'd crashed at home after a double shift, not the handful of employees who'd left hours ago. I stood, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet, and crossed the room, the floor cool against my skin. The knob turned under my hand, and there he was, Edward Carter, framed in the doorway, like a specter from a life I'd buried. He looked older than he had that morning, the lines on his face etched deeper under the harsh fluorescent light spilling from the hall. His suit was still impeccable, charcoal gray and crisp, but his tie was loosened, a rare crack in the armor he'd always worn. His gray eyes met mine, and for a moment, we just stood there, the air between us thick with everything we'd never said. The city's pulse thrummed outside, a distant heartbeat, but in here, it was just us, father and daughter, victor and vanquished, two stubborn souls who'd built walls too high to climb. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, his voice low, rougher than I remembered, like the weight of the day had scraped it raw. I stepped aside, my throat tight, and gestured to the room. "It's not your boardroom, but it's mine." He walked in, his steps deliberate, his gaze sweeping the space, the sagging bookshelves, the mismatched chairs, the flickering bulb overhead. I watched him take it in, waiting for the judgment, the sneer I'd braced for. But his expression stayed unreadable, his hands slipping into his pockets as he stopped by the window, staring out at the same view I'd been lost in moments before. The silence stretched, heavy and taut, until I couldn't stand it anymore. "Why are you here, Dad?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest, my voice steadier than I felt. "You said your piece this morning." I said mine. He didn't turn, just kept staring at the city, his reflection sharp against the glass. "I underestimated you," he said finally, the words slow, deliberate, like he was tasting them for the first time. "Thought you'd fold without the name, the money. Thought you'd come back when it got hard." I laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "You made it hard. Gave me one night to pack, cut me off like I was nothing. And now you're here, because your empire's falling apart." He turned then, and the look in his eyes stopped me cold. Not anger, not the cold authority I'd grown up fearing, but something softer, something broken. "Yes," he said simply, and the admission hit me like a punch. "Carter Financial's done, Allison. The board's scrambling, but there's no saving it, not without a miracle. I came to ask for one." My breath caught, a sharp hitch I couldn't hide. I'd seen the numbers, knew the stakes, but hearing it from him, raw, unfiltered, made it real in a way the folder hadn't. I sank into my chair, my legs unsteady, and gestured to the one across from me. He sat, the cheap wood creaking under his weight, and for a moment, we were just two people in a crumbling office, not a titan and his rebel daughter. "You want Phoenix," I said, my voice flat, cutting through the haze. "Not a partnership and acquisition. You want me to take what's left of Carter Financial and fold it into what I've built." He nodded, his hands resting on the desk, palms up like a surrender. "It's the only way. Your client base, your model. It's lean, it's working. We've got assets still, connections, a name that's worth something even now. Merge them, and Phoenix could be more than a scrappy startup. It could be a player." I stared at him, the words sinking in, each one a brick in a wall I wasn't sure I wanted to build. My fingers curled into fists, nails biting into my palms as the anger flared, hot, familiar, a fire I'd stoked for years. "You don't get it, do you? Phoenix isn't yours to claim. I built it to spite you, to prove I didn't need you. And now you want me to save you with it?" "Not me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The people who'll lose everything when we go under. Employees, clients, families. You know what bankruptcy looks like, it's not just numbers. It's lives." The anger faltered, snagged on the truth in his words. I'd seen it at Phoenix, small businesses teetering, owners begging for loans to keep their doors open. Carter Financial's collapse wouldn't just be his failure. It'd ripple out, a tidal wave I couldn't outrun. My chest tightened, a moral tangle I hadn't expected, and beneath it, a flicker of something else. Pride, yes, but also a chance I hadn't dared to dream of. "And what's in it for me?" I asked, leaning forward, my voice sharp. "You think I'll just hand you the reins? Let you swoop in and take credit?" "No reins," he said, meeting my gaze, unflinching. "You run it. Your name, your rules." I stepped back. "Consult if you want me, vanish if you don't. This isn't my redemption, Allison. It's yours." The room spun slightly, the walls tilting as his words landed. Mine. Phoenix Capital. Not just surviving but thriving, swallowing his empire whole and making it something better. The defiance I'd carried for years shifted, hardening into something new. Determination, yes, but laced with a bittersweet satisfaction I hadn't anticipated. I'd fought to escape him, to build something he couldn't touch, and now he was offering it to me on a platter, not out of love, maybe, but out of necessity. It wasn't the reconciliation I'd once craved, but it was something real, something I could hold. I stood, pacing to the window, needing the cool glass against my fingertips to ground me. The city stretched out below, a sprawl of lights and lives, and I saw it. Phoenix rising, not from his ashes but with them, a force I'd shape with my own hands. The fear was there, a cold thread weaving through my resolve, but it was quieter now, drowned out by the steady hum of possibility. Terms, I said, turning back to him, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. I keep full control. Phoenix stays mine, name, vision, everything. Your assets come in, but your board doesn't. And you. I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. You don't get to pull strings. Not anymore. He nodded, a slow incline of his head, and I saw it again. That flicker of respect, deeper now, unshaken. Agreed. I'll have the lawyers draw it up tomorrow. You'll have everything you need. The words hung there, final and binding, and with them came a release, a weight lifting, not all at once, but enough to breathe. I crossed back to the desk, sitting across from him, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small under his gaze. I felt equal, maybe more, a woman who'd turned defiance into power, pride into purpose. Why now? I asked, softer now, the question slipping out before I could stop it. After everything, why give me this? He leaned back, his hands folding in his lap, and for a moment, he looked old, not just tired, but worn, a man who'd lost more than he'd ever admit. Because you earned it, he said simply. I didn't see it then, thought you were throwing it all away. But you didn't. You built something better than I ever did. I'm not too proud to admit that now. The ache in my chest sharpened, a mix of triumph and grief, and I nodded, unable to find words. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was close enough, a bridge we might never fully cross but could stand on together, just for a moment. The office felt less like a cage now, more like a throne room of my own making, its flaws a testament to the fight I'd won. Then it's done, I said, my voice firm, sealing it. Phoenix acquires Carter Financial. I'll call Jim. We'll start tomorrow. He stood, offering his hand across the desk, and I took it, his grip firm but not crushing, a handshake between equals. Good luck, Allison, he said, and there was a weight to it, a farewell I didn't expect. You too, I replied, and meant it. He turned to go, his silhouette stark against the doorway, and I watched him leave. The man who'd shaped me, broken me, and now handed me the keys to something bigger. The door clicked shut, and I sank back into my chair, the silence settling around me like a blanket. Outside, the city glowed, its lights steady now, a canvas I'd paint with my own colors. I thought of Jim, of the cot we'd shared, the ramen dinners, the nights I'd doubted I'd make it this far. I thought of Phoenix, small, scrappy, mine, and what it could become with Carter's bones to build on. The fear was still there, a whisper I'd never fully silence, but it was matched by something stronger. Satisfaction, deep and quiet, a pride that felt like coming home. The clock still read 7:42, but time didn't matter anymore. I'd risen, not just from his ashes, but from my own, and the road ahead was mine to walk, with Jim, with Phoenix, with a resolve that wouldn't bend. The city waited, and so did I, ready for whatever came next.